She was already dead. She just hadn't stopped smiling yet. Ambassador Miriam Okafor-Hale held the glass at eye level, the amber liquid inside catching the cold light of Threshold Vale's atrium, and somewhere in the artificial gravity of that room, in the 6th second after she'd swallowed, the toxin had already found her bloodstream and begun its patient work. She didn't know that yet. Nobody did. For the next 10 minutes, she would keep being the calmest person in a room built by species that had never once needed to be calm. 10 minutes earlier, the room had smelled like ozone and expensive incense, the kind the VEV delegation burned to signal status, and Miriam had been standing exactly where protocol required a provisional delegate to stand 3 steps back from the central dais, close enough to be seen, far enough to be irrelevant. She'd learned that geometry a decade ago. She'd learned it the way you learn where the shallow end of a pool is when you're the only one in the water who can't swim, except she could swim fine. She'd just spent 11 years pretending the current was stronger than it was. "They've moved you back again," her aide murmured beside her, a wiry young man named Tobias Reyes Whitfield who had the particular gift of sounding amused about things that should have made him furious. "Third summit in a row. At this rate, they'll seat us in the corridor." "The corridor has better acoustics," Miriam said, not moving her eyes from the dais. "You can hear them lying from further away." Tobias almost laughed, caught himself, turned it into a diplomatic cough. Around them, delegates from 11 member species arranged themselves in the loose hierarchy that Concord custom demanded, and no Concord law had ever written down, because writing it down would have been admitting it existed. The VEV stood closest to the dais, tall and silver-skinned, their translator collars humming a half-second behind their mouths. The Atari clustered near the food service in a knot of soft chittering, always hungry, always watching. And near the back, in robes the color of old rust, stood 3 delegates of the Threll Combine who did not chitter, did not hum, and did not look at anyone directly, which Miriam had learned over 11 years was its own kind of language. She had shaken hands with one of them an hour earlier. Magistrate Joran Dask had a grip like a man closing a door he intended to lock. "Ambassador," he'd said, in the flat, over-precise Concord standard that species used when they wanted you to know they'd rather be speaking anything else. "Your fleet review numbers were illuminating this quarter." "We try to keep things transparent," Miriam had said. "Transparency," Dask repeated, like he was turning the word over to check for a blade inside it. "Yes." That was the whole exchange. She'd thought about it twice since, and both times decided it meant nothing, because in 11 years of summits, the Threll had never once threatened anything they didn't already have 3 other ways to accomplish quietly. That was the miscalculation that would later get written into 4 separate intelligence briefings back on Earth, dissected by people with far more stars on their shoulders than Miriam had ever worn, and none of them would manage to explain it any better than she could have, standing right there, glass in hand. Sometimes the wolf smiles because the trap is already sprung. The toast was Ambassador Speaker Voth's idea, which should have been the first warning, because Voth's ideas were reliably terrible in ways that took months to notice. 11 years since Earth's provisional accession, he'd said, gesturing with the theatrical warmth of someone who has never once meant a word he said in public, a milestone worth marking. He'd had glasses brought out, real glass, real liquid, an old Concord custom meant to signal that this was a room where poison would be unthinkable, because a room that served drinks to enemies was a room that had decided, structurally, not to have enemies in it. It was, Miriam would have said if she'd lived to say it, an excellent scam. She raised her glass because the alternative was to be the delegate who refused a toast of unity at her own accession anniversary, and provisional members did not get to be the ones who refused things. She said something gracious about partnership and patience. She'd said some version of that sentence at every summit for a decade, and it had gotten easier each time, the way any lie gets easier with practice, except it wasn't a lie, not exactly. It was a bet, and bets you keep making eventually start to feel like faith. She drank. Tobias would remember later in the debrief he gave 3 separate times to 3 separate rooms of very serious people, that nothing looked wrong for almost 90 seconds. Miriam kept talking. She made the Atari delegate laugh, a real laugh, the wet clicking kind that meant something had actually landed. She turned to say something to Dask, who was watching her now directly, which he had not done all summit. Then her hand went to the stem of the glass, like she needed it to remember which way was down. "Ambassador," Tobias said. She smiled at him, the same smile she'd worn through 11 years of being underestimated, patient and unbothered, a smile that had disarmed 4 different species worth of contempt, and said, with the mild irritation of someone noticing a minor breach of etiquette, "I think I've been terribly rude to my own bloodstream." Those were, functionally, her last words, though she said several more after that, none of them coherent, all of them recorded by the room's ambient sensors and by no fewer than 9 separate delegation drones. Because in a room built to prove that nobody there would ever need to hide a murder, everybody had been very thorough about filming one. She went down slowly. That was the detail that would haunt the security footage analysts on Earth for weeks. Not the speed of it, but the slowness, the way her legs simply stopped agreeing with the rest of her. The way Tobias caught her before she hit the floor and the room around them did not, for 4 full seconds, stop talking. Because nobody registers a collapse as an emergency until someone screams. And Tobias, God love him, did not scream. He said, very quietly, "I need a medic," in the tone of a man ordering a coffee, because some part of his training had understood before the rest of him that panic would be a luxury they couldn't afford in front of 11 watching species. The medics came. The VEV physician arrived first, knelt, ran a scanner over Miriam's throat, and went very still in a way that translated across species without any collar's help. By the time the diagnosis reached the Concord's own security office, untraceable neurotoxin, dermal and ingested dual vector, degraded within the bloodstream to something the scanners could no longer even categorize. Miriam Okafor-Hale, 61 years old, former Marine Corps colonel, Earth's calm and gray-haired face to a galaxy that had spent a decade deciding she wasn't worth taking seriously, was dead on the floor of a room specifically designed to make her murder impossible. Magistrate Yoran Dask did not leave the room. That would be remarked upon later, in the same intelligence briefings, as either supreme arrogance or supreme confidence, and nobody on Earth's side would ever fully agree on which. He stood near the back in his rust-colored robes, and when the VEV physician announced, in the flat clinical Concord standard that made tragedy sound like a maintenance report, that the ambassador could not be revived, Dask's expression did not change at all. He simply turned to the delegate beside him and said something too quiet for the translators to catch, and the delegate beside him, an Atari trade attaché named Core, went very pale beneath his chiton, the way you go pale when someone tells you a joke you're not sure you're allowed to laugh at. Tobias would spend the rest of his life not sleeping properly, and would say, in every version of his debrief, that the worst part wasn't the poison, or the collapse, or even the 11 years of context that made this possible. The worst part was the paperwork. Because within 6 hours, before Miriam's body had even been released for transport back to Earth, the Concord's Office of Interspecies Continuity issued an internal memorandum, leaked, inevitably within the hour, because nothing in this galaxy stayed sealed longer than it took someone with a grudge to find a copy machine, that described the death of Earth's senior diplomat as a regrettable incident, species value pending review. Species value pending review. Elena Vasquez-Thorne read those 5 words in a secure briefing room 14 floors beneath a mountain in Colorado, at 3:47 a.m. local time. Standing in a blazer she'd put on backward because nobody had thought to warn her before the call that she'd be reading her friend's obituary reduced to an administrative shrug. She read it twice. She did not read it a third time, because the second time had already told her everything she needed to know about how this would go if Earth let it. She set the tablet down on the table with a care that was somehow more frightening than if she'd thrown it, and said, to the room of aides who had not yet fully absorbed that the woman who'd spent a decade being the human face of patience was gone, "Get me Okafor-Hale. Not a call. In person. Now." "Ma'am, it's 4 in the morning." "I'm aware of the time," Alina said, and something in her voice made the aide stop reaching for excuses and start reaching for a phone instead. "Tell him to bring the Riverstone folder." The aide, who had worked in that building for 6 years and had never once heard that word said aloud, wrote it down like it might evaporate if he didn't, and left the room faster than protocol technically allowed. Alina stood alone for a moment, looking at the frozen image on the wall display, Miriam's face, mid-toast, glass raised, caught by some drone's camera in the half-second before the poison had reached her enough to matter, still smiling the smile that had held a decade of contempt at arm's length, so the rest of them could keep building in the dark. 11 years, Alina said quietly, to no one, to the empty room, to the ghost of a friend who'd known this might happen and had gone to every summit anyway. "You gave them 11 years, Miriam." She reached into her jacket, pulled out a keycard she had carried for a decade and used exactly twice, and walked toward the door at the far end of the briefing room. A door with no handle, no markings, and a biometric lock that had not been triggered since the year the fleet's first hull was laid beneath the Antarctic ice. Behind that door was a drawer. Inside the drawer was a single sealed folder with one word printed on its cover. Alina had never had to open it before. She opened it now. The folder was thinner than Alina had expected, which felt like its own kind of insult, as if 11 years of secrecy should have weighed more than a few sheets of laminated paper. She carried it back into the briefing room the way you carry something that might go off, and by the time she set it on the table, Fleet Admiral Okafor-Hale was already standing in the doorway, still in the sweater he'd been wearing when the call woke him, hair pressed flat on one side from a pillow he would not see again for 3 days. "You said Riverstone," he said, "not a question." "I said Riverstone." He looked at the folder like it was an old dog that had finally, after years of good behavior, bitten someone. "You know what happens the moment I open that." "I know what happens the moment we don't," Alina said. "Miriam's dead, Desmond, poisoned in a room the Concord swore was sacred, and their response was a memo, 5 words, species value pending review." Something moved behind Okafor-Hale's eyes that the aides in the room would later describe, in private, in ways that never quite made it into any official transcript, as the look of a man who has spent 11 years hopping he'd never have to use the thing he built. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and opened the folder himself, because some decisions you don't let someone else make the first cut on. "Say it," Alina said. "Protocol Riverstone," Okafor-Hale said, and the words landed in that underground room like a stone dropped into very still water, full fleet emergence. Nobody in the room breathed for a second. Then a colonel near the back, a woman named Adiz Branniganosai, who had been in that bunker for 6 years and had genuinely, truly in her heart of hearts, believed she would retire before this word was ever spoken aloud, said, very carefully, "Sir, with respect, does that mean what I think it means?" "It means," Okafor-Hale said, "that in about 4 hours the government of a planet is going to learn that it has a lot more military than it was told it had." Dark humor, someone would say later, is what happens when the truth is too large to hold sober. General Havard Kim Ferreira, who had spent the last decade nominally in charge of Earth's conventional orbital defense, the decoy fleet, the obsolete hulls, the ships everyone had been allowed to see, leaned back in his chair and said, to no one in particular, "Well, I suppose this means my budget requests for the last 10 years finally make sense to somebody." "They never made sense," Okafor-Hale said, without looking up from the folder. You wanted gold-plated railings on a ship meant to look like scrap metal. It's called morale, Desmond. It's called Norwegian shipbuilders laughing at us for 6 months. Elena almost smiled, which was the closest thing to relief anyone in that room would get for a long while. And then Okafor-Hale closed the folder and stood, and the moment closed with him. "I need the code phrase authenticated by both of you," he said, nodding at Elena and at the silver-haired man beside her, Secretary Halvorsen, who held the other half of the launch authority nobody outside 4 people on the planet knew existed. "Once it goes out, there's no version of tomorrow where this stays quiet. Every sailor, pilot, and engineer who spent a career training for a war we told them was hypothetical is about to find out it wasn't." "Do it," Elena said. He did. The order that went out at 4:12 a.m. Mountain Time did not sound like the end of an 11-year secret. It sounded, to the several 100,000 people who received it in barracks and bunkers and orbital stations across 6 continents and 4 asteroid belts, like 11 syllables of nonsense read in a bored voice by an automated system. "Riverstone confirmed. All hands, Riverstone confirmed." In a shipyard outside Bergen, a retired welder named Ingrid Solheimaz was 3 cups of coffee into a morning. She'd planned to spend arguing with her grandson about whether his university thesis on post-scarcity labor economics had any bearing on reality, when her old work radio, the one she kept on a shelf out of habit, the one she'd sworn to a room full of very serious men in uniforms a decade ago she would never speak about, crackled to life with those 11 syllables. She did not say anything to her grandson. She stood up from the table, walked to a locked drawer in the hallway closet that he had asked about exactly once, years ago, and been told it was old tax paperwork, and unlocked it with a key she'd worn on a chain under her shirt for 10 years without him ever noticing. Inside was a photograph of a hull silver-black, impossibly long, wrong in the way that things are wrong when they're better than they should be allowed to be, and a small brass pin in the shape of a wave. She held the pin for a long moment, and when her grandson called from the kitchen asking if she was all right, she said, in a voice steadier than she felt, "Fine, love. Just remembering something." She did not cry until he'd gone back to his laptop. That was the moment repeated, in shape if not detail, across the planet and past it, in a maintenance bay beneath the ice shelf at Queen Maud Land, where 300 engineers who had spent a decade telling their families they worked for a climate research initiative watched the lights of a drydock the size of a small city flicker on for the first time in years. In a hollowed-out asteroid past Neptune's orbit, where a skeleton crew of 4,000 personnel who had not seen direct sunlight in 18 months received the order and began, calmly, without panic, the process of waking a fleet that had been sleeping since before some of them were born. It was, Priya Wallesgade would think later, standing on the observation deck of the flagship Continuance as its running lights came up section by section along a hull 2 kilometers long, the strangest thing about a secret that big, how quiet it was to end. Priya had been 19 when she enlisted, 23 now, and had spent 4 years training on a ship whose true designation she had not been permitted to know until 40 minutes ago, when a briefing officer with visibly shaking hands had informed her entire deck crew that the Continuance was not, in fact, a long-range survey vessel, and that the survey missions she'd flown for 2 years had, in fact, been calibration runs for weapon systems she had never once been told existed. "So the singing," she said slowly to the officer, because someone had to say something, and dark humor was cheaper than screaming. "The low-frequency thing we picked up near the Kuiper drills, that wasn't a survey artifact." "No, Ensign. That was us testing something." "Yes, Ensign. Something big enough to sing." The officer, a lieutenant named Reyes Okonkwo who had clearly not slept in some time, said, "The Continuance isn't the biggest ship in the fleet, Ensign. It's the flagship because Admiral Okafor-Hale likes the acoustics." Priya had laughed once, sharp and startled, because that was such an insane sentence to say out loud in the middle of the end of the world as she'd understood it. And then she'd stopped laughing, because her grandmother's face had come into her mind, her grandmother, who had served in the Concord liaison office during Earth's first accession, who had known Ambassador Okafor-Hale personally, who had once said, over dinner, in the offhand way people mention things they've decided not to dwell on. Miriam always said the hardest part of the job wasn't the insults. It was that if we ever stopped smiling, they'd know we had a reason to stop. Priya had not understood that sentence at 19. She understood it now, standing on a deck 2 kilometers long, watching a fleet the galaxy had never been meant to see come fully, quietly awake. 4 hours after Riverstone confirmed had gone out across 6 continents and 4 asteroid belts, Admiral Okafor-Hale stood in the Continuance's command bridge. The real one, not the modest simulation deck Priya had trained on for 2 years, and gave the first operational order of humanity's unmasking. It was not, to the visible disappointment of at least 2 junior officers who had clearly been hopping for something more cinematic, an order to attack. "We are not declaring war," Okafor-Hale said, to a bridge crew that had, collectively, expected this moment of their lives to feel like more than a man in a slightly wrinkled uniform speaking in the same even tone he used for weather reports. "We are conducting an audit." "An audit," repeated Commander Talia Brennanosi, Okafor-Hale's second, in the tone of someone checking she'd heard correctly. "The Threll Combine controls 70% of Concord-registered hyperfuel refining," Okafor-Hale said. "Every refinery, every shipping lane, every financial instrument tied to their monopoly is about to receive an unscheduled inspection from a fleet they didn't know existed. We are not there to conquer anything. We are there to freeze it, document it, and make it very, very difficult for anyone to pretend Ambassador Okafor-Hale died of natural causes." "And if they fire on us?" Priya asked, before she could stop herself, and every head on the bridge turned, because ensigns did not typically speak first in rooms like this, and she felt the heat climb her neck even as she held her ground, because someone needed to ask it. Okafor-Hale looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the particular weight of a man deciding whether to answer a question honestly in front of a room that needed honesty more than comfort. "Then we'll have our answer about who they are," he said, "and so will everyone watching." The fleet moved out in silence, running dark across 4 systems at once, and the ships the galaxy had spent a decade dismissing as Earth's entire military arsenal sat exactly where they'd always sat, doing exactly nothing, because they had never been the point. They were bait, and bait does not need to move to do its job. It only needs to be looked at while something much larger swims beneath. At a Threll refining station on the edge of the Corvin Belt, a night shift supervisor named Van Kett registered an anomaly on his scanners at 600 hours station time. Dozens of unregistered signatures, appearing not with the violent flare of a jump drive, but with the unsettling smoothness of ships that had simply, somehow, stopped hiding. He called his superior. His superior called the Combine's regional command. The regional command called Magistrate Joran Dask, who was, at that exact moment, standing in his private quarters on Threshold Vale, reviewing the final transit logs on Ambassador Okafor-Hale's death, logs he had personally ensured would show nothing useful to anyone, when his aide burst in without knocking, which the aide had never once done in 6 years of service. "Magistrate," the aide said, breathless, "Earth's fleet. It's not the fleet we've seen." Dask set down the tablet in his hand very slowly. "How many ships?" he said. "We don't know yet. The estimates keep climbing." "How many?" Dask said again, quieter, and something in his voice made the aide's next words come out smaller than he'd intended. "Thousands, magistrate, at least." Joran Dask stood very still for a moment, in the same way he had stood very still in the atrium 4 days earlier, watching a woman he had ordered killed collapse to the floor with a smile still fading from her lips, And for the first time since this had all begun, the stillness was not confidence. It was arithmetic, and the numbers had just stopped working in his favor. Priya Wallace-Gade had not slept in 31 hours, and the strange part, the part she kept turning over in her head like a stone she couldn't put down, was that she wasn't tired. She was something past tired, some state the human body apparently kept in reserve for the day it found out the war it had trained for was real, and the adrenaline had burned through every ordinary signal that might have told her to rest. She found Admiral Okafor-Hale in the observation lounge 2 decks below the bridge, alone, looking out at the black through a viewport that had been engineered, she now knew, to withstand weapons fire that didn't officially exist yet according to any Concord registry. He had a cup of something in his hand that had gone cold a while ago. He didn't turn when she entered. "Ensign," he said, "you should be resting." "So should you, sir." A faint sound that might have been a laugh. "Fair." She stood beside him for a moment, working up the nerve for the thing she'd come to say, and when she finally said it, it came out flatter than she'd meant. "My grandmother served in the liaison office during the first accession." "I know," Okafor-Hale said. "De la Wallace-Gade. She briefed me twice years ago before your time, sharp woman. Didn't take well to being told she was wrong. She used to say the hardest part wasn't the insults." Priya kept her eyes on the black outside the viewport because it was easier than looking at him. It was that if we ever stopped smiling, they'd know we had a reason to. Okafor-Hale was quiet for a long moment. She was right. "So what happens now that we've stopped smiling?" Priya turned to face him, and whatever exhaustion had been holding her voice steady cracked slightly at the edges. "Sir, with respect, I've spent 4 years training to fly a ship I didn't know the true purpose of. I believed the survey missions. I believed the story. And in one morning I found out my entire service record is a cover identity for something my own grandmother probably knew about and never told me. I need to understand what we're doing here. Are we protecting Earth, or are we finally getting to be the monster everyone always suspected we might be?" It was not, strictly, the kind of question an ensign asked a fleet admiral. Okafor-Hale didn't reprimand her for it. He turned the cold cup over in his hands once, like he was deciding how honest to be, and then set it down on the console beside him. "When I was your age," he said, "I served under a commander who used to say that power revealed carelessly becomes a threat, and power revealed responsibly becomes a choice. The fleet you're standing on right now is not the threat, ensign. It's the choice. Whether we become the thing they always suspected depends entirely on what we do with the next 72 hours, and I intend to make sure the answer is no. Not because I'm certain the galaxy deserves our restraint. Because Ambassador Okafor-Hale spent 11 years earning the right for us to prove we have some. And if restraint gets us killed, then at least we'll have died as ourselves," Okafor-Hale said, "instead of as the monster they wanted us to become. That's the only kind of victory that means anything to me anymore." Priya didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. She simply stood there a moment longer in the quiet hum of a ship the size of a city, and let the words settle into whatever place inside her would carry them for the rest of whatever came next. She did not know yet that the next came very fast. At the exact moment Priya was standing in that observation lounge, Magistrate Yoran Dask was 3 systems away, in a chamber aboard the Threll flagship Ashcrown, doing something he had not expected to be doing 4 days after ordering the murder of a human diplomat. Begging. Not in those words, of course. Dask did not think of it as begging. He thought of it as coalition building, a term that had served politicians of every species for as long as politics had existed to hide the smaller, uglier verb underneath it. "They have thousands of ships," he said, to the assembled holographic projections of 6 Concord member delegations, appearing without warning, converging on refineries and shipping lanes with military precision. "This is not the behavior of a provisional member seeking justice. This is the behavior of a species that has spent 11 years building a weapon behind a smile, and using the death of their own diplomat as the excuse to finally use it. It was, Dask knew, a lie built on a truth, which was the only kind of lie worth telling. The fleet was real. The precision was real. The only thing invented was the motive, and motive, in his experience, was the easiest part of any story to rewrite once fear had already done the work of making people want to believe it. The VEV delegate's projection flickered, considering. "You're suggesting a preemptive strike coalition." "I'm suggesting," Dask said, with the careful weight of a man choosing each word like a stone laid across a river, "that we cannot afford to discover what Earth intends only after they've already done it." 3 of the 6 delegations agreed to further discussion within the hour. It was, by the standards of Concord diplomacy, lightning speed fear. Dask thought with something close to satisfaction, still worked exactly the way it always had. He did not know, as he closed that call, that 7 minutes earlier, on a secure channel routed through 4 relay stations, and encrypted with a key that had not existed until that morning, Secretary Elena Vasquez-Thorne had authorized the release of something Ambassador Miriam Okafor-Hale had sealed under her own diplomatic authority 11 years ago, on the very first day of Earth's provisional accession, with instructions that it only be opened if she died in the line of duty and Earth's leadership, judged the moment required it. She had called it, in the sealed files, only header, in case they ask what we really wanted. The logs went out across every Concord public network simultaneously. A deliberate choice, Vasquez-Thorne's people would explain later, because a leak could be dismissed as propaganda, but a simultaneous broadcast to every species at once could not be edited, delayed, or spun before the galaxy had already seen it raw. They were not dramatic. That was, perhaps, the most devastating thing about them. 11 years of Miriam Okafor-Hale's private diplomatic recordings, meant only for Earth's own archives, showed a woman absorbing insult after insult with a patience that had never once, in any single recording, curdled into the resentment any reasonable person would have expected. There was footage of her being seated in corridors instead of chambers, 3 separate times, and saying nothing beyond a polite request that the meeting continue. There was a recording of her negotiating trade terms so unfavorable to Earth that her own aide could be heard off camera, urging her to walk out, and her quiet reply, "We don't need favorable terms. We need to still be in the room in 20 years. And there was, near the end of the compiled file, a single unlisted recording from 11 years earlier, on the exact day of accession, Miriam alone in a small transport cabin, speaking not to any delegation but into a private log meant only for whoever might one day need to hear it. "If you're watching this," she said, tired, younger, her hair not yet fully gray, "it means something happened to me and someone decided the galaxy needed to understand what we actually wanted. So let me say it plainly because I may not get another chance to. We do not want war. We never wanted war. We wanted 11 years or 20 or however long it took to prove we could sit in the corridor and still deserve the chamber. If they've taken that from me, I hope whoever is speaking for Earth now still believes that's worth proving. Because the alternative, becoming exactly the thing they've always been afraid we are, that's not a victory. That's just losing on a longer timeline." The recording ended. Across a dozen worlds, in briefing rooms and public forums, and one particularly ill-fated live broadcast, where an Atari political commentator named Fesh Koran had, 4 minutes earlier, been passionately arguing that Earth's fleet proved humanity had always intended conquest. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. Fesh Koran, still on air, still visibly unaware for 3 full seconds that the feed had not cut, said the only thing his stunned mind produced. "Well, that's I may need to revise my earlier position." It became, within the hour, a meme across 4 inhabited systems, the galaxy's collective way of processing the fact that it had just watched its own certainty die in real time. Public opinion did not turn all at once. It cracked first in small places. A VEV trade minister quietly withdrawing support for Dask's coalition proposal. An Atari Elder Council issuing a statement expressing profound reconsideration. Ordinary citizens across a dozen worlds asking, in the flattened, furious language of people who feel lied to, why their own governments had been so quick to believe the worst about a species that had apparently spent 11 years hopping for the opposite. Aboard the Ashcrown, Magistrate Yoran Dask watched the coalition he had built in a matter of hours begin, within a matter of hours more, to quietly, politely, come apart. 2 delegations have withdrawn, his aide reported, not meeting his eyes. A third is requesting an emergency session to reconsider. Dask said nothing for a long moment. He thought of the atrium, of the smile that had not stopped, even at the end, even as the poison worked. He had believed with total confidence that a species this patient was simply a species that hadn't yet found its claws. He was beginning, for the first time, to consider the far more dangerous possibility that they had found their claws a long time ago and simply understood something about power that he did not. "Get me a channel to Threshold Vale," he said finally. "If the fleet is coming, I intend to be the one who decides how this ends." He did not yet know that Fleet Admiral Desmond Okafor-Hale had already made that decision for him, 3 hours earlier, and was, at that very moment, moving toward the same station with a fraction of his fleet and no intention of firing first. Threshold Vale had never been designed to withstand a fleet. It had been designed as a monument to the idea that no fleet would ever need to come. A neutral station, ringed in soft light, its architecture deliberately without weapons batteries, because the Concord had built it on the theory that violence between member species was a solved problem. Ambassador Miriam Okafor-Hale had died proving that theory wrong in the span of 90 seconds. Fleet Admiral Desmond Okafor-Hale intended to arrive there and prove something else. He brought 11 ships, not the thousands that had swept through Threll refineries 3 days earlier, not even a fraction significant enough to matter in a straight engagement. 11 ships, the continuance among them, running with full transponders active, no stealth fields, no ambiguity about what they were or where they were going. It was, Commander Talia Brennanosai had said when she saw the deployment order, either the bravest thing she'd ever seen a fleet commander do, or the single worst tactical decision in the history of naval warfare, and she genuinely could not decide which. 11 ships, she said again, as if repeating it might reveal some hidden logic. Sir, the Threll and their new coalition partners could field 3 times that at Threshold Vale alone. I know, Okafor-Hale said. Then why? Because if we arrive with an overwhelming force, every species watching remembers only that Earth showed up ready to conquer a station full of civilians and diplomats, he said. And if we arrive vulnerable and still don't fire first, they remember something else entirely. I need them to remember something else entirely, Commander. That's worth more than 11 ships either way. Priya Wallacegade stood at her station during the approach, watching Threshold Vale grow from a point of light to a structure the size of a small moon. Its docking rings lit gold against the black, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a strange, tight pride in the fact that the man giving these orders had chosen, deliberately, to walk into a room that could kill him rather than send a force that could simply erase the problem. They're hailing us, the comms officer said. Multiple channels, Concord general frequency, Threll priority frequency, and a pause, a flicker of something crossing her face. A personal channel, addressed to you directly, sir, Magistrate Yoran Dask. Put him through, fleet-wide feed. I want everyone watching this to see it the same way. The image resolved on the bridge's main display. Yoran Dask, standing in rust-colored robes aboard the Ashcrown, his 3 coalition partners' ships visible in formation behind the feed's edges, easily outnumbering Okafor-Hale's 11, by a factor that should have made this conversation very short. "Admiral," Dask said, "you've brought a remarkably small delegation for a species so concerned with proving its strength." "I'm not here to prove strength, Magistrate," Okafor-Hale said. "I'm here to collect a murderer." Something flickered across Dask's expression, not fear, not yet, but the first small crack of a man realizing the script he'd prepared did not match the room he was standing in. A serious accusation, one that would require evidence acceptable to a full Concord tribunal. "We have the evidence. The poison synthesis signature matches a Threll military laboratory registered to your own regional command. The financial trail matches transfers authorized under your seal 3 weeks before the summit. And we have testimony, recorded and verified, from the proxy your office hired, who is currently in the custody of the Atari trade delegation and considerably more talkative than you were hopping." Okafor-Hale let that sit for a moment before continuing. "So here is what happens now, Magistrate. You have 2 choices, and I am only going to offer them once, in front of everyone watching." Dask said nothing. Behind him, one of his coalition partners' feeds, the VEV delegate, had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone recalculating an alliance in real time. "Option 1, Okafor-Hale said. You surrender yourself to Concord Tribunal, full jurisdiction, full transparency, and Earth abides by whatever judgment that tribunal reaches, even if it disagrees with our own. Option 2. He paused, and Priya, watching from her station, realized this was the moment the entire fleet had been built for, 11 years of hidden hulls and buried shipyards converging on a single sentence. You surrender yourself to Earth's justice instead. No tribunal, no committee. Just us, and the death of a woman who spent a decade trying to keep this exact moment from happening." It was, on its surface, an absurd offer. No rational actor facing a murder charge chooses the justice system of the species he wronged over the neutral tribunal of a body he'd spent years currying favor with. Which was precisely why Dask, watching a fleet of only 11 ships and calculating that Earth's supposed restraint must be weakness rather than strategy, made the single worst decision of his political career. "I'll take Earth's justice, Admiral," he said, and there was something almost triumphant in his voice, the sound of a man who believed he had just found the exit from a trap. "Let the galaxy watch how a species that claims patience actually behaves when it finally holds the knife." Okafor-Hale did not smile, but something in his posture shifted, the particular stillness of a man whose opponent had just walked exactly where he'd hoped. "Very well," he said. "Ensign Wallace-Gade, bring up the feed." Priya's hands moved before her mind had fully caught up with the order, patching through a live transmission that had been prepared and waiting for exactly this moment. Footage, gathered over the last 72 hours by Earth's forensic teams working the Threll refineries seized during the audit, of internal Combine communications discussing not just the assassination, but a pattern, going back years, of quietly sabotaging trade negotiations with 3 other minor species. All timed to protect the Combine's hyperfuel monopoly. It was not evidence of a single murder. It was evidence of a decade of quiet predation that had simply never had a fleet large enough to be noticed before. "This is what Earth's justice looks like, Magistrate," Okafor-Hale said, as the footage rolled across every screen on Threshold Vale and every Concord network beyond it. "Not vengeance, not a knife. Documentation, transparency, and a tribunal of your own victims, convened publicly with every fact laid bare for the species you've spent years quietly exploiting to see for themselves. You didn't ask for mercy, Magistrate. You asked for exposure. I'm happy to give you exactly that." The silence that followed on the bridge of the Ashcrown was total. Dask's 3 coalition partners, the VEV, the Atari, a third delegate who had said almost nothing throughout the entire exchange, watched their own screens fill with a decade of evidence they had never been shown. And one by one, their formation ships began, quietly, without announcement, to break away. By the time the Ashcrown's own Combine officers moved to place Yoran Dask into custody, their custody, not Earth's, because Okafor-Hale had never once ordered a weapon armed. The coalition that had, 4 days earlier, seemed poised to justify a preemptive strike against humanity had dissolved entirely, undone not by force, but by the simple, devastating fact of being seen clearly for the first time. The Concord tribunal that convened 6 weeks later, in a chamber considerably less ornate than Threshold Vale's atrium, granted Earth full voting membership, by a margin so overwhelming that even the procedural clerk reading the results aloud paused, mid-sentence, as if checking she'd read the number correctly. It was not, the historians would note in the decades that followed, a vote cast out of fear. Fear had been available to the Concord for exactly 72 hours, and fear had chosen in the end to dissolve rather than fight. It was a vote cast instead out of something rarer, the simple, uncomfortable recognition that a species holding overwhelming power had been offered the chance to become exactly the monster everyone assumed it was, and had chosen, deliberately, publicly, at real cost to itself, not to. Fleet Admiral Desmond Okafor-Hale did not attend the ceremony marking Earth's accession. He was, at that exact hour, standing at a quiet memorial garden outside what had once been the Colorado bunker, in front of a modest stone marker bearing a single name and 2 dates, 11 years apart. "You gave them 11 years, Miriam," he said, echoing words Elena Vasquez Thorne had spoken alone in a briefing room months earlier, though he did not know that. "I hope wherever you are, you know we didn't waste the 12th. He stood there a while longer in the cold in silence, and then he did the thing he had not managed to do at her funeral, when protocol and grief had left no room for anything but formal words. He told her quietly that she had built the peace that let him not have to be the villain of this story, and that whatever came next for Earth, out among a galaxy that finally saw them clearly, it would be built on the foundation she had laid, one insult, one smile, one patient toast at a time. Ensign Priya Wallace-Gade, standing on the observation deck of the Continuance months later, watching Earth's fleet, no longer hidden, no longer a secret buried under ice and rock, simply present, simply known, take its place for the first time among the ships of a galaxy that had finally been forced to look at them honestly, thought of her grandmother, and of a woman she had never met but somehow understood completely. "They spent 11 years asking what we were hiding," she said quietly, to no one, to the black beyond the viewport, to whatever version of the future was still being written. "Turns out it wasn't a fleet, it was patience. If Earth's patience just ran out for you too, drop a comment with your favorite twist, follow for part 2, and share this with someone who loves a slow burn HFY.